The war was entering its final and most brutal chapter when a shocking report reached General George Patton's headquarters. A Red Cross nurse, protected by international law and dedicated only to saving lives, had allegedly been executed by a German officer under circumstances that horrified even hardened veterans of World War II. As rumors spread through the ranks, anger turned into a demand for justice. But what happened next was something few expected. In a war filled with vengeance, duty, and impossible choices, Patton faced a decision that would reveal not only the ruthless side of a battlefield commander, but also the complex code of honor that guided him through the chaos of war. As Allied investigators continued gathering testimony, the atmosphere around the case became increasingly tense. Every new witness seemed to add another layer to the story. Medical personnel spoke of confusion, fear, and the growing danger faced by anyone caught between advancing armies and retreating German units. Some accounts differed in minor details, but they shared a common theme: a nurse carrying out her humanitarian duties had been denied the protections that international law was supposed to guarantee. For many American soldiers, the incident struck a deeply personal chord. Throughout the war, medics and nurses had earned enormous respect. They were often the first to run toward danger when everyone else was seeking cover. Countless wounded men owed their lives to medical personnel who ignored gunfire, artillery, and exhaustion to treat the injured. The thought that someone wearing the Red Cross symbol could be deliberately targeted filled many troops with outrage. Patton's headquarters was receiving reports from across Germany almost hourly. Entire enemy formations were surrendering. Bridges were being captured intact. German resistance was crumbling in some sectors while remaining fierce in others. Yet amid these historic military developments, the case remained on Patton's desk. To some officers, this seemed surprising. They expected the fast-moving general to focus solely on the battlefield. Instead, he devoted valuable time to understanding exactly what had happened. The captured German officer remained under guard while questioning continued. Those who met him were struck by his composure. He was not an untrained fanatic or a frightened teenager pulled into the war's final battles. He was a professional officer who understood military regulations and the conventions governing armed conflict. That fact made the accusations against him even more serious. If proven true, they would represent not merely a tragic battlefield mistake but a conscious violation of rules recognized by armies around the world. As the days passed, Patton reviewed reports personally. He had spent decades studying military history and understood that wars did not end when the shooting stopped. The behavior of victorious armies would shape the peace that followed. The world was already learning of terrible crimes committed across occupied Europe. News from liberated camps shocked even experienced combat veterans. Against that backdrop, Allied commanders knew their own actions would be scrutinized by history. Several officers urged swift punishment. They argued that an example needed to be made. Soldiers who had witnessed friends die while protected medical personnel risked their lives felt little sympathy for the accused. Some openly demanded execution. Their anger reflected years of sacrifice and loss. Many had fought continuously since North Africa or Normandy. They had seen villages destroyed, civilians killed, and comrades buried far from home. Patton listened to these opinions but remained focused on procedure. He believed that punishment without proper examination would undermine the very principles the Allies claimed to defend. To him, justice required more than anger. It required proof. That distinction became increasingly important as emotions surrounding the case intensified. Meanwhile, rumors spread throughout the ranks. Stories grew larger with each retelling. Some soldiers claimed the nurse had been murdered in cold blood before witnesses. Others insisted the officer had boasted about his actions. Not all these stories could be verified. Investigators found that separating fact from rumor was often difficult in the confusion of war. Yet enough evidence existed to keep the case alive and demand serious attention. The nurse herself became a symbol in the minds of many troops. Though few had known her personally, she represented the thousands of medical workers who served near the front lines. These men and women operated under constant danger while carrying no offensive mission. Their purpose was simple: save lives. The allegation that one of them had been executed touched something fundamental in every soldier who understood the value of mercy amid destruction. As Allied forces drove deeper into Germany, surrendering enemy troops became a common sight. Columns of prisoners marched along roads under armed guard. The contrast was striking. On one side stood an army advancing toward victory. On the other stood a defeated force watching its world collapse. Yet the unresolved case continued to cast a shadow over headquarters discussions. Eventually, investigators delivered additional findings to Patton's staff. The evidence was not perfect, but it painted a clearer picture than before. Witness statements aligned on several critical points, and the officer's role appeared increasingly difficult to dismiss. The moment of decision was approaching. Those closest to Patton noticed a change in his mood. He remained outwardly confident, but the responsibility weighed heavily. Whatever action he took would send a message not only to his own troops but also to history. Would justice be driven by fury, or would it follow law even when emotions demanded something harsher? The answer was coming. Deep inside a defeated Germany, as the Third Reich neared its final collapse, Patton prepared to confront the accused officer directly. The meeting would become one of the most talked about moments surrounding the case, and those who witnessed it would never forget what happened when the famous general finally faced the man accused of executing a Red Cross nurse. The meeting took place against the backdrop of a Germany that was rapidly falling apart. Allied columns rolled across highways once reserved for Nazi victory parades. Smoke drifted over shattered towns, and streams of refugees moved through the countryside searching for safety. In the midst of that historic collapse, a single prisoner was escorted under guard to face one of the most feared and respected Allied commanders of the war. The German officer entered the room carrying himself with the discipline expected of a career soldier. Despite the circumstances, he attempted to maintain an air of dignity. Years of military service had taught him to hide fear, but those present could sense the tension. He knew the accusations against him. He knew that the outcome of this confrontation could determine the rest of his life. Patton studied the man carefully before speaking. The American general had spent much of the war evaluating officers, judging character, and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He understood that uniforms could conceal many things. Some men wore them with honor. Others used them to justify cruelty. Determining which type stood before him was now his task. The questioning began calmly. Witnesses later recalled that Patton did not immediately raise his voice. Instead, he asked direct questions about the incident, the circumstances surrounding it, and the officer's actions during those chaotic final weeks of fighting. The German answered carefully, often emphasizing the confusion of battle. He suggested that orders had been unclear and that the situation on the ground had been far more complicated than later reports described. Patton listened without interruption. Those who knew him expected an explosion of anger, but none came. The silence in the room became almost uncomfortable. Every answer was weighed, every explanation examined. The general seemed determined to understand not only what had happened but why. As the interrogation continued, contradictions began to emerge. Testimony collected from medical personnel and other witnesses did not fully match the officer's version of events. Certain details changed when questions were repeated. Explanations that initially sounded reasonable became harder to defend under closer examination. The room grew tense. Officers standing nearby sensed that Patton's patience was nearing its limit. For days he had reviewed reports, studied statements, and considered evidence. He had approached the case with restraint because he believed justice required discipline. But discipline did not mean indifference. Finally, the conversation turned directly to the status of the nurse. Patton asked whether the officer understood the protections granted to Red Cross personnel under international law. The answer came quickly. Yes, he understood them. As a professional officer, he had been aware of those protections throughout the war. That admission changed everything. According to accounts that circulated afterward, Patton's expression hardened. The issue was no longer ignorance or confusion. The officer had acknowledged knowledge of the very rules he was accused of violating. Even if some details remained disputed, the moral significance of that fact was impossible to ignore. The general reportedly reminded him that armies could not function without standards. Medical workers occupied a special position because they represented humanity in its most desperate moments. Wounded soldiers from either side depended on them. Without such protections, war descended into something even darker than violence. For a moment, the room fell silent. Outside, engines rumbled and distant artillery echoed across the German countryside. The war was still being fought, but everyone present understood that this discussion concerned something larger than military operations. It concerned the principles that would survive after the guns fell silent. The German officer attempted one final defense. He spoke of collapsing fronts, impossible choices, and the pressure placed on commanders during the Reich's final days. Yet even as he spoke, the justification sounded increasingly hollow. Millions of soldiers had faced fear and uncertainty without abandoning every rule of civilized conduct. Patton's response carried the weight of months of combat and years of military experience. He had seen courage and cowardice, honor and brutality, sacrifice and cruelty. What angered him most was not merely the alleged crime itself but the idea that it could be excused by circumstance. War created hardship, but it did not erase responsibility. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through nearby units. Soldiers who heard fragments of the exchange believed a dramatic punishment was imminent. Many expected immediate retribution. Some even hoped for it. The execution of a Red Cross nurse had become symbolic of the countless tragedies witnessed during the war's final phase. Yet Patton understood that vengeance and justice were not the same thing. The decision he was preparing to make would test that distinction. It would reveal whether the victorious Allies intended to govern through anger or through law. As evening approached, final reports were reviewed and recommendations submitted. The evidence now stood before Patton in its fullest form. The fate of the accused officer rested in his hands. Outside, the Third Reich was collapsing hour by hour, but inside headquarters another verdict was approaching, one that would determine how this shocking case would be remembered long after the war itself had ended. As the final reports were placed before him, Patton understood that his decision would carry significance far beyond a single prisoner. The war in Europe was drawing to its dramatic conclusion. German armies were surrendering by the tens of thousands. Entire cities were falling without major resistance. Yet amid the celebration of approaching victory, there remained an obligation to confront the crimes and tragedies that had occurred during the conflict. The evidence gathered by investigators could not erase every uncertainty. Few wartime cases were perfectly documented, especially during the chaos of collapsing front lines. However, the accumulated testimony painted a deeply troubling picture. Witness statements, military records, and the officer's own admissions regarding his knowledge of international law convinced Allied authorities that the allegations could not simply be dismissed as rumor or misunderstanding. Many soldiers expected swift revenge. They had spent years fighting across battlefields soaked with blood. They had watched friends die, seen civilians suffer, and witnessed destruction on a scale that defied imagination. To them, the execution of a Red Cross nurse represented a violation of one of the few remaining boundaries that separated warfare from outright barbarism. But Patton refused to allow anger alone to determine the outcome. Instead of ordering immediate punishment driven by emotion, he insisted that the officer be handed over through proper military and legal channels. The accused would face formal investigation and judicial review rather than battlefield vengeance. Some soldiers considered the decision too restrained. Others recognized the principle behind it. The Allies had repeatedly declared that they were fighting not merely to defeat Germany but to restore law and civilization. If that claim meant anything, it had to apply even when dealing with a hated enemy. The decision sent a powerful message throughout the ranks. Justice, Patton believed, had greater strength when it was disciplined rather than impulsive. A firing squad carried out in anger might satisfy a desire for revenge, but a lawful process demonstrated confidence in the values the Allies claimed to defend. In the weeks that followed, Germany's surrender became a reality. Across Europe, church bells rang, crowds celebrated, and exhausted soldiers finally began to believe the nightmare was ending. Yet victory did not erase the memories of those who had suffered. The story of the murdered nurse continued to circulate among veterans, medical personnel, and officers who had heard of the case. For Red Cross workers and military nurses, the incident became a painful reminder of the risks they faced. Although protected by international agreements, they often worked close to combat zones where law and humanity could disappear in an instant. Their courage rarely attracted the same attention as battlefield heroics, yet countless lives depended upon their willingness to serve under dangerous conditions. Patton himself moved on to the many responsibilities that accompanied occupation and reconstruction. New challenges emerged daily as Allied authorities confronted the aftermath of Nazi rule. Nevertheless, those who knew him remembered how seriously he had treated the case. For a commander famous for aggressive warfare, the episode revealed another side of his character, a belief that military honor required adherence to principles even when emotions demanded something else. Years later, historians would debate specific details of the story, as they often do with wartime events. Memories faded, accounts differed, and some elements became difficult to verify with absolute certainty. Yet the broader lesson remained remarkably clear. The true measure of justice is often revealed not when dealing with friends but when judging enemies. The execution of a humanitarian worker represented an attack on values shared across nations and armies. Medical personnel exist to save life amid destruction. Their protection is one of the foundations upon which civilized warfare, imperfect as it may be, attempts to stand. When that protection is violated, the consequences reach far beyond a single victim. In the end, what endured was not simply the fate of one German officer. It was the example of how a victorious commander chose to respond. Patton could have allowed fury to guide him. Many would have applauded such a choice. Instead, he sought accountability through law, believing that civilization could not be rebuilt on revenge alone. As Europe emerged from the ruins of World War II, countless stories of courage, sacrifice, cruelty, and redemption became part of history. Among them was the story of a nurse whose life ended amid the chaos of war and of the commander who insisted that her death deserved more than anger, it deserved justice. In a conflict defined by unimaginable destruction, that determination to preserve the rule of law became one small but meaningful victory for the principles the Allies claimed to defend.